Zadig, Chapter 15 The Combats. The queen was received at Babylon with all those transports of joy which are ever felt on the return of a beautiful princess who hath been involved in calamities. Babylon was now in greater tranquillity. The prince of Hyrcania had been killed in battle. The victorious Babylonians declared that the queen should marry the man whom they should choose for their sovereign. They were resolved that the first place in the world, that of being husband to Astarte king of Babylon, should not depend on cabals and intrigues. They swore to acknowledge for king the man who, upon trial, should be found to be possessed of the greatest valor and the greatest wisdom. Accordingly, at the distance of a few leagues from the city, a spacious place was marked out for the list, surrounded with magnificent amphitheatres. Thither the combatants were to repair in complete armor. Each of them had a separate apartment behind the amphitheatres, where they were neither to be seen nor known by anyone. Each was to encounter 4 knights, and those that were so happy as to conquer 4 were then to engage with one another. So that he who remained the last master of the field would be proclaimed conqueror at the games. 4 days after he was to return with the same arms and to explain the enigmas proposed by the Magi. If he did not explain the enigmas he was not king, and the running at the lances was to be begun afresh till a man would be found who was conqueror in both these combats. For they were absolutely determined to have a king possessed of the greatest wisdom and the most invincible courage. The queen was all the while to be strictly guarded. She was only allowed to be present at the games, and even there she was to be covered with a veil. But was not permitted to speak to any of the competitors, that so they might neither receive favor, nor suffer injustice. These particulars Astarte communicated to her lover, hoping that in order to obtain her he would show himself possessed of greater courage and wisdom than any other person. Zadig set out on his journey, beseeching Venus to fortify his courage and enlighten his understanding. He arrived on the banks of the Euphrates on the eve of this great day. He caused his device to be inscribed among those of the combatants, concealing his face and his name, as the law ordained, and then went to repose himself in the apartment that fell to him by lot. His friend Kadda, who, after the fruitless search he had made for him in Egypt, was now returned to Babylon, sent to his tent a complete suit of armor, which was a present from the queen. As also, from himself, one of the finest horses in Persia. Zadig presently perceived that these presents were sent by Astarte, and from thence his courage derived fresh strength, and his love the most animating hopes. Next day, the queen being seated under a canopy of jewels, and the amphitheatres filled with all the gentlemen and ladies of rank in Babylon, the combatants appeared in the circus. Each of them came and laid his device at the feet of the Grand Magi. They drew their devices by lot, and that of Zadig was the last. The first who advanced was a certain lord, named Atobad, very rich and very vain, but possessed of little courage, of less address, and hardly of any judgment at all. His servants had persuaded him that such a man as he ought to be king. He had said in reply, "Such a man as I ought to reign," and thus they had armed him cap a pie. He wore an armor of gold enamelled with green, a plume of green feathers, and a lance adorned with green ribbons. It was instantly perceived by the manner in which Atobad managed his horse, that it was not for such a man as he that heaven reserved the scepter of Babylon. The first knight that ran against him threw him out of his saddle. The second laid him flat on his horse's buttocks, with his legs in the air, and his arms extended. Atobad recovered himself, but with so bad a grace that the whole amphitheatre burst out a-laughing. The third knight disdained to make use of his lance. But, making a pass at him, took him by the right leg and, wheeling him half round, laid him prostrate on the sand. The squires of the game ran to him laughing, and replaced him in his saddle. The fourth combatant took him by the left leg, and tumbled him down on the other side. He was conducted back with scornful shouts to his tent, where, according to the law, he was to pass the night, and as he climbed along with great difficulty he said, "What an adventure for such a man as I!" The other knights acquitted themselves with greater ability and success. Some of them conquered 2 combatants, a few of them vanquished 3, but none but Prince Otamus conquered 4. At last Zadig fought him in his turn. He successively threw 4 knights off their saddles with all the grace imaginable. It then remained to be seen who should be conqueror, Otamus or Zadig. The arms of the first were gold and blue, with a plume of the same color. Those of the last were white. The wishes of all the spectators were divided between the knight in blue and the knight in white. The queen, whose heart was in a violent palpitation, offered prayers to heaven for the success of the white color. The two champions made their passes and vaults with so much agility, they mutually gave and received such dexterous blows with their lances, and sat so firmly in their saddles, that everybody but the queen wished there might be two kings in Babylon. At length, their horses being tired and their lances broken, Zadig had recourse to this stratagem. He passes behind the Blue Prince, springs upon the buttocks of his horse, seizes him by the middle, throws him on the earth, places himself in the saddle, and wheels around Otamus as he lay extended on the ground. All the amphitheatre cried out, "Victory to the White Knight!" Otamus rises in a violent passion, and draws his sword. Zadig leaps from his horse with his saber in his hand. Both of them are now on the ground, engaged in a new combat, where strength and agility triumph by turns. The plumes of their helmets, the studs of their bracelets, the rings of their armor, are driven to a great distance by the violence of 1,000 furious blows. They strike with the point and the edge. To the right, to the left, on the head, on the breast, they retreat. They advance. They measure swords. They close. They seize each other. They bend like serpents. They attack like lions, and the fire every moment flashes from their blows. At last Zadig, having recovered his spirits, stops, makes a feint, leaps upon Otamus, throws him on the ground and disarms him, and Otamus cries out, "It is thou alone, O White Knight, that oughtest to reign over Babylon." The queen was now at the height of her joy. The knight in blue armor and the knight in white were conducted each to his own apartment, as well as all the others, according to the intention of the law. Mutes came to wait upon them and to serve them at table. It may be easily supposed that the queen's little mute waited upon Zadig. They were then left to themselves to enjoy the sweets of repose till next morning, at which time the conqueror was to bring his device to the Grand Magi, to compare it with that which he had left, and make himself known. Zadig, though deeply in love, was so much fatigued that he could not help sleeping. Atobad, who lay near him, never closed his eyes. He arose in the night, entered his apartment, took the white arms and the device of Zadig, and put his green armor in their place. At break of day he went boldly to the Grand Magi to declare that so great a man as he was conqueror. This was little expected. However, he was proclaimed while Zadig was still asleep. Astarte, surprised and filled with despair, returned to Babylon. The amphitheatre was almost empty when Zadig awoke. He sought for his arms, but could find none but the green armor. With this he was obliged to cover himself, having nothing else near him. Astonished and enraged, he put it on in a furious passion, and advanced in this equipage. The people that still remained in the amphitheatre and the circus received him with hoots and hisses. They surrounded him and insulted him to his face. Never did man suffer such cruel mortifications. He lost his patience, with his saber he dispersed such of the populace as dared to affront him, but he knew not what course to take. He could not see the queen, he could not claim the white armor she had sent him without exposing her. And thus, while she was plunged in grief, he was filled with fury and distraction. He walked on the banks of the Euphrates, fully persuaded that his star had destined him to inevitable misery, and resolving in his own mind all his misfortunes, from the adventure of the woman who hated one-eyed men to that of his armor. "This," said he, "is the consequence of my having slept too long. Had I slept less, I should now have been king of Babylon and in possession of Astarte. Knowledge, virtue, and courage have hitherto served only to make me miserable." He then let fall some secret murmurings against Providence, and was tempted to believe that the world was governed by a cruel destiny, which oppressed the good and prospered knights in green armor. One of his greatest mortifications was his being obliged to wear that green armor which had exposed him to such contumelious treatment. A merchant happening to pass by, he sold it to him for a trifle and bought a gown and a long bonnet. In this garb he proceeded along the banks of the Euphrates, filled with despair, and secretly accusing Providence, which thus continued to persecute him with unremitting severity.